The young soldiers snickered as the weathered woman in the wheelchair struggled to navigate the uneven pavement outside Riverside Military Academy's main entrance. "Someone's grandmother got lost looking for the bingo hall," one of them whispered, loud enough for her to hear. Then General Patricia Hawthorne emerged from her staff car, caught sight of the faded eagle tattoo barely visible beneath the woman's rolled-up sleeve, and immediately dropped to one knee in respect. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Before we dive into this incredible story of hidden valor, forgotten sacrifice, and a secret that the military buried for over 40 years, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to join our community of people who believe that every hero story deserves to be told. What would you do if you witnessed someone being mocked and dismissed, only to discover they had once been one of America's most elite warriors? Let's find out what happens next in this extraordinary, true story. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the prestigious grounds of Riverside Military Academy in Virginia as 73-year-old Dorothy Clearwater maneuvered her wheelchair along the sidewalk with practiced determination. Her gnarled hands, marked by decades of arthritis, gripped the wheel rims as she made her way toward the Academy's memorial wall. This wasn't supposed to be such a difficult journey, but the recent budget cuts had eliminated the handicapped parking spaces nearest to the monument, forcing her to navigate nearly 2 blocks of cracked sidewalks and construction barriers. Dorothy had been making this pilgrimage every November 15th for the past 28 years, always alone, always carrying the same worn leather messenger bag, always stopping at the same section of black granite where names were etched in gold. Most people assumed she was just another elderly widow visiting a deceased husband's memorial. They had no idea that she was searching for names that would never appear on any official monument, names of women who had died in service to their country but whose sacrifices had been systematically erased from military history. As she approached the Academy's main courtyard, a group of first-year cadets were taking a break from their afternoon drills. The young men, barely 18 and full of the arrogance that came with wearing a uniform for the first time, noticed the elderly woman struggling with her wheelchair over a particularly difficult curb cut. Instead of offering assistance, they saw an opportunity for entertainment. "Check it out," called out Cadet Trevor Brennan, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of someone who had never faced real adversity. "Looks like someone's great-grandmother is trying to storm the Academy." His companions erupted in laughter, their voices echoing off the brick buildings surrounding them. Cadet Ryan Mitchell, a lanky 19-year-old from Connecticut, pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is going to be hilarious," he said, zooming in on Dorothy as she paused to catch her breath. "Maybe she thinks this is a retirement home." Dorothy heard every word, but she had learned long ago to ignore such comments. Her weathered face, lined with the kind of deep creases that came from decades spent squinting into hostile terrain, remained impassive. She had endured far worse than the mockery of untested boys playing soldier. Her focus remained fixed on reaching the memorial wall, where she would once again search for names that should have been there but weren't. "Hey lady," Brennan called out, emboldened by his friend's laughter. "You do realize this is a military academy, right? Not a nursing home. The geriatric ward is about 10 miles that way." He pointed dramatically toward the nearest hospital, causing another wave of snickers from his group. Dorothy finally looked up, her steel-gray eyes meeting Brennan's gaze with a steadiness that should have warned him he was making a mistake. "I'm exactly where I need to be, son," she replied, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had commanded respect in far more dangerous situations than this. But the cadets were too young and too foolish to recognize the steel beneath her gentle southern accent. Mitchell stepped closer, still filming with his phone. "What's in the bag, Grandma? Knitting supplies?" Maybe some hard candy to bribe your way past security. As Dorothy reached for the messenger bag to secure it more tightly to her wheelchair, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a portion of what appeared to be a tattoo on her forearm. The design was faded and partially obscured, but the edges of wings and talons were clearly visible military ink from an era when such markings were far less common, especially on women. "Oh, this is rich," Brennan said, noticing the tattoo. "Grandma's got some ancient prison ink. What's next? Are you going to tell us you were in the army?" The laughter from his companions grew louder, attracting the attention of other cadets, and even some of the academy staff who had gathered nearby. What had started as casual cruelty was becoming a public spectacle, with Dorothy at the center of a growing circle of amused onlookers, just as the situation threatened to escalate further. The distinctive sound of a military staff car pulling up to the curb cut through the noise. The vehicle's flags and insignia immediately commanded attention from the cadets, who straightened their postures and attempted to look less like the bullies they had just revealed themselves to be. General Patricia Hawthorne, a woman in her early 50s with the bearing of someone who had spent 3 decades earning every star on her uniform, stepped out of the vehicle with her characteristic purposeful stride. She had been on her way to a routine meeting with the academy's commandant when she noticed the commotion in the courtyard. Her initial intention was simply to ensure that her cadets were conducting themselves with appropriate military bearing. But as her gaze fell upon the woman in the wheelchair, something made her pause. There was something familiar about the way Dorothy held herself the straight back despite her obvious physical limitations, the alert eyes that missed nothing, the calm dignity in the face of harassment. And then Hawthorne's attention was drawn to the partially visible tattoo on Dorothy's forearm. The general's expression changed immediately. Her eyes widened with recognition, then narrowed with what could only be described as profound respect, mixed with disbelief. Without hesitation, General Hawthorne approached Dorothy's wheelchair and, to the absolute shock of every cadet present, dropped to one knee beside her. "Ma'am," the general said, her voice carrying a reverence that silenced the entire courtyard, "it is an honor to meet you. I believe you served with the Night Talons." The effect of those 2 words, Night Talons, was immediate and electric. The cadets stopped laughing. The casual observers grew silent. And Dorothy Clearwater, for the first time in 28 years of making this pilgrimage alone, found herself face to face with someone who knew exactly who she was and what she had sacrificed for her country. The real story was about to begin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dorothy Clearwater had not expected this day to be different from the 27 that had come before it. For nearly 3 decades, her annual journey to Riverside Military Academy had followed the same quiet ritual. Drive the 140 miles from her small apartment in Lexington, Kentucky, park as close as possible to the memorial wall, and spend exactly 1 hour searching through the names etched in granite for faces that would never appear there. At 73, Dorothy moved through the world with the measured pace that came from a body that had endured more than its fair share of punishment. The wheelchair had become a permanent part of her life 8 years earlier, after her 3rd hip replacement surgery had gone wrong, leaving her with chronic pain and limited mobility. But the chair was just the latest in a long series of adaptations. She had made over the decades small accommodations that allowed her to continue the mission that had driven her since 1995. Every November, 15th marked the anniversary of Operation Midnight Eclipse, a classified mission that had taken place in the mountains of Afghanistan in 1994. Most Americans had never heard of the operation because officially it had never happened. The 12 women who had participated in the mission had been sworn to secrecy under the highest levels of classification. When the mission succeeded beyond all expectations, saving hundreds of civilian lives and preventing a humanitarian catastrophe. Credit was quietly reassigned to a conventional Special Forces unit. When 3 of the Night Talons died during the extraction, their deaths were recorded as training accidents. Their bodies buried without military honors, their families told. Their daughters had died in routine exercises. And 13 photographs, 12, showed the faces of her fellow Night Talons, including the 3 who had never made it home. The 13th was a group photo taken just before their final mission, 13 women in unmarked combat gear, their faces young and determined, their eyes holding the kind of intensity that came from knowing they were about to undertake something that would either make history or be buried forever. She had been Lieutenant Dorothy Clearwater then, 24 years old and one of only 3 officers in a unit that existed in the gray spaces between official military doctrine and operational necessity. The Night Talons had been formed in 1992, during a period when the military was quietly experimenting with all-female special operations units. The theory was that women could operate in certain environments, where male soldiers would be immediately identified as threats: refugee camps, civilian areas, situations requiring a subtler approach than traditional special forces could provide. For 2 years, the Night Talons had conducted operations across 3 continents, achieving success rates that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. They had extracted intelligence assets from hostile territory, provided security for humanitarian missions in war zones, and conducted reconnaissance operations that conventional units couldn't approach. Their effectiveness came not just from their specialized training, but from the fact that they were essentially invisible to enemy forces who had been trained to watch for male soldiers. But invisibility, Dorothy had learned, was a double-edged sword. When the Night Talons succeeded, their victories were often attributed to other units or classified beyond acknowledgement. When they made sacrifices, those sacrifices disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of military record-keeping. By 1995, the unit had been quietly disbanded, its members scattered across different commands with strict non-disclosure agreements and the understanding that their service would never be officially recognized. The transition back to conventional military life had been jarring for all of them. Dorothy had spent 3 more years in the Army, but found herself assigned to administrative roles that felt like punishment after the intensity of special operations. She had watched male colleagues receive promotions and recognition for operations she knew the Night Talons had conducted. She had attended award ceremonies where other units received commendations for missions her team had completed. By 1998, she had had enough. Dorothy left the military with the rank of captain, though she knew she would have made major if her real service record had been acknowledged. She moved to Kentucky, took a job teaching high school history, and tried to build a civilian life that didn't require her to pretend that the most important years of her military service had never happened. But forgetting had proved impossible, especially after the letters started arriving. One by one, the surviving Night Talons had reached out to each other, drawn together by the shared burden of carrying secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. They learned that Rachel Thornton had committed suicide in 2001, unable to cope with the isolation and the feeling that her service had meant nothing. They discovered that Amanda Rodriguez had developed severe PTSD after leaving the military, but couldn't get proper treatment because her most traumatic experiences were classified. They watched as Linda Harrison struggled with addiction, having never received proper recognition or closure for the friends she had lost in Afghanistan. By 2010, only 7 of the original 13 Night Talons were still alive. The others had been claimed by suicide, addiction, medical complications from untreated combat injuries, and the slow erosion that came from carrying invisible wounds. Dorothy had started making her annual pilgrimages not just to honor the 3 who had died in Operation Midnight Eclipse, but to bear witness for all of her sisters who had served in silence and died in obscurity. Today should have been like all the others, a quiet hour of remembrance, followed by the long drive home and another year of waiting. Dorothy had no way of knowing that her simple act of rolling up her sleeve to adjust her bag would reveal the faded eagle tattoo that had remained hidden for decades. She couldn't have predicted that a routine encounter with disrespectful cadets would place her directly in the path of someone who might finally understand the weight she had been carrying. As General Hawthorne knelt beside her wheelchair, speaking the name that Dorothy had not heard spoken aloud in over 20 years, she felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since 1995, someone in uniform was looking at her not as an elderly woman to be dismissed or pitied, but as a soldier whose service had mattered. The carefully constructed wall of silence that had protected military secrets for nearly 3 decades was about to crack wide open. The silence that followed. General Hawthorne's recognition of the night talons stretched across the courtyard like a held breath. Dorothy felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she processed what had just happened. In 28 years of carrying this secret, no one, not even other military personnel, had ever identified her unit. The night talons had been buried so deep in classified archives that most people who might have known about them were either dead or had convinced themselves it had all been a fever dream. But before Dorothy could respond to the general's unexpected recognition, Cadet Brennan's voice cut through the moment with the sharp edge of authority that only comes from youth and ignorance. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Brennan interjected, stepping forward and addressing General Hawthorne directly, "I think you might be mistaken about this woman. We've been observing her for several minutes, and her behavior has been increasingly erratic." His voice carried the confident tone of someone who believed he was protecting his superior from embarrassment. General Hawthorne slowly rose from her kneeling position, her expression shifting from reverence to something far more dangerous. "Excuse me, Cadet." Brennan, either oblivious to the warning in the general's voice or too committed to his course of action to back down, continued with the relentless momentum of someone digging his own grave. "The woman arrived here without proper identification or escort. She's been attempting to access restricted areas of the memorial wall, and when we approached her to offer assistance, she became defensive and uncooperative." Dorothy felt the familiar burn of indignation rise in her chest. This was the pattern she had experienced countless times throughout her military career, and in the decades since men, particularly young men, assuming they knew better than she did about her own capabilities and intentions. The fact that she was now elderly and in a wheelchair had only amplified their condescension. "That's not true," Dorothy said firmly, her voice carrying the clear authority of someone accustomed to being heard over battlefield noise. "I've been coming to this memorial for 28 years. I have never attempted to access any restricted areas, and I certainly wasn't defensive when you approached me. I was trying to ignore your inappropriate comments about my age and physical condition." Cadet Mitchell, still holding his phone and apparently recording the entire encounter, laughed nervously. "Come on, General, look at her. Does she really look like military material to you? I mean, night talons? That sounds like something out of a video game or a comic book." The derision in his voice was unmistakable, and Dorothy saw something flicker across General Hawthorne's face that suggested the young man had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. But before the general could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" Colonel James Whitfield, the Academy's deputy commandant, approached the group with the measured stride of someone accustomed to diffusing conflicts between cadets and visiting dignitaries. He was a tall, lean man in his early 50s with the kind of precise bearing that suggested a career spent in administrative rather than combat roles. "No problem, Colonel," Brennan said quickly, apparently sensing an opportunity to reshape the narrative. We were just trying to help this elderly woman find her way to the appropriate visitor areas when General Hawthorne arrived. I think there might be some confusion about this woman's background." Colonel Whitfield's gaze moved from the cadets to Dorothy, taking in her wheelchair, her modest civilian clothes, and what he clearly assumed was her harmless elderly appearance. "Ma'am, I'm Colonel Whitfield. Are you perhaps looking for someone specific? If you're visiting a family member's memorial, I'd be happy to have someone from our staff assist you with locating the appropriate section." The assumption in his voice was clear. Dorothy was a grieving relative, possibly confused or disoriented. Certainly not someone with any legitimate claim to military recognition. It was the same patronizing tone she had heard from countless officers throughout her career, the voice of men who couldn't conceive that a woman, particularly an aging woman in a wheelchair, might have knowledge or experience that exceeded their own. "Colonel Whitfield," General Hawthorne said. Her voice is clearly confused about where she belongs, Brennan interrupted, his confidence growing as he sensed support from the colonel. "General, I understand you want to be polite, but we can't have unauthorized individuals making claims about military service, especially claims involving units that don't exist in any official records." Dorothy felt the words hit her like physical blows. Here it was again, the same dismissal, the same assumption that her experience was either fabricated or irrelevant. She looked around the growing circle of onlookers and saw the familiar expressions: pity, skepticism, and the kind of uncomfortable amusement that people displayed when confronted with someone they assumed was delusional. "Young man," Dorothy said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her, "I would strongly advise you to stop talking before you embarrass yourself further." But Mitchell, emboldened by what he perceived as support from Colonel Whitfield and validation from his recording audience, pushed forward with the kind of reckless bravado that comes from never having faced real consequences for poor judgment. "Listen, lady, I don't know what kind of stories you've been telling yourself over the years, but stolen valor is a serious crime. Claiming to be part of some secret special forces unit is not only disrespectful to real veterans, it's potentially illegal." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Stolen valor, the charge that Dorothy was impersonating a veteran, claiming service she had never performed, dishonoring the memory of real soldiers. It was perhaps the most devastating accusation that could be leveled against someone who had actually served, particularly someone whose real service had been deliberately erased from official records. Dorothy felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. This was the nightmare scenario she had always feared, being publicly accused of lying about service that she couldn't prove because it had been classified beyond recognition. The very secrecy that had protected national security interests now made her vulnerable to charges of fraud. General Hawthorne's expression had shifted from warning to barely controlled fury. "Cadet Mitchell, I strongly suggest you stop recording and step away from this conversation immediately." But Colonel Whitfield, apparently misreading the general's anger as frustration with the situation rather than the cadets, moved to what he clearly thought was the appropriate resolution. "General Hawthorne, I appreciate your patience with this situation," he said, his tone suggesting that he was the reasonable adult managing an awkward encounter. "Mrs.?" He looked expectantly at Dorothy. "Clearwater," Dorothy replied, her voice flat. "Mrs. Clearwater, I think it would be best if we had someone from our security office verify your visitor authorization and perhaps help you locate the appropriate memorial section. I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding about protocol." The words were polite, but the meaning was clear. Dorothy was being treated as a potential security risk, someone whose presence needed to be officially documented and controlled. After 28 years of making this pilgrimage without incident, she was suddenly being classified as a problem to be managed rather than a veteran to be respected. Dorothy looked at General Hawthorne, seeing both recognition and frustration in the woman's eyes. The general clearly understood who Dorothy was and what she represented, but she was also trapped by the very classification systems that had buried the Knight Talons in the first place. Acknowledging Dorothy's service publicly would require revealing classified information that Hawthorne might not have the authority to declassify. "Colonel Whitfield," Dorothy said quietly, "before you make any official determinations about my authorization to be here, you might want to ask General Hawthorne what she knows about Operation Midnight Eclipse." The reaction was immediate and electric. General Hawthorne's eyes sharpened with something that looked like hope mixed with concern. Colonel Whitfield's expression shifted from patronizing patience to genuine confusion. And Cadet Brennan, apparently sensing that the conversation had moved beyond his understanding but unwilling to abandon his position, doubled down on his skepticism. "See," he said to Colonel Whitfield, "now she's making up classified operation names. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This woman is clearly having some kind of psychological episode." Dorothy looked around the circle of faces, some curious, some concerned, some openly dismissive, and realized that she had reached a crossroads she had been avoiding for nearly 3 decades. She could retreat, as she always had before, accepting the dismissal and the assumptions, preserving the secrets that protected others while burying her own truth. Or she could fight back, finally choosing to defend not just herself, but the memory of 12 other women who had served their country in silence and died without recognition. She chose to fight. The mention of Operation Midnight Eclipse had the effect Dorothy had hoped for, but not in the way she expected. Rather than validating her claims, it seemed to galvanize the opposition against her. Colonel Whitfield's expression hardened with what appeared to be genuine concern about security protocols, while Cadet Brennan's skepticism transformed into something closer to alarm. "Ma'am," Colonel Whitfield said, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone shifting into official mode, "I'm going to need to ask you to come with me to the security office. Claims involving classified operations require immediate verification, especially from individuals without current military credentials." Dorothy felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the November air. This was exactly the scenario she had feared for nearly 3 decades, being forced to defend service that had been deliberately buried under layers of classification. Every piece of evidence that could prove her legitimacy was either destroyed, sealed beyond her access level, or existed only in the memories of people who were legally bound not to discuss it. "I understand your concerns, Colonel," Dorothy replied, maintaining her composure despite the growing crowd of onlookers. "But I should point out that I've been visiting this memorial annually for 28 years without incident. My background check was conducted and approved when I first began these visits in 1995. Cadet Mitchell, still recording with his phone, stepped closer with the aggressive confidence of someone who believed he was documenting a major security breach. "A background check from 1995? That's ancient history. Do you have any current identification? Any proof of military service that isn't conveniently classified?" The question hit Dorothy in a place that still ached after all these years. The deliberate erasure of the Knight Talons from official records meant that her DD to 214 discharge papers showed only her conventional military assignments. Her specialized training, her combat deployments, her unit affiliations, all of it had been redacted or omitted entirely. To anyone reviewing her official military record, she appeared to be a former logistics officer with a completely unremarkable service history. "My discharge papers are in my bag," Dorothy said, reaching for her messenger bag despite knowing that the documents would only reinforce the skepticism rather than dispel it. As she pulled out the folder containing her military records, she caught General Hawthorne's eye and saw something that looked like sympathetic understanding. "Colonel." Whitfield accepted the papers and began reviewing them with the methodical precision of someone experienced in military documentation. Dorothy watched his expression shift from professional courtesy to confusion. then to something that might have been disappointment. According to these records, Mrs. Clearwater, you served as a logistics coordinator and supply officer. There's no mention of any special operations training, no combat deployments, and certainly no involvement in any classified missions. He looked up at her with the expression of someone who had just caught a child in an elaborate lie. These documents directly contradict the claims you've been making. Dorothy had been expecting this moment for decades, but it still felt like a physical blow. Colonel, those records were deliberately sanitized after my unit was disbanded. Standard protocol for personnel involved in classified operations is to remove sensitive information from their official files. Convenient, Brennan muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. So all the evidence that would prove her claims just happens to be classified or destroyed. How convenient that the only proof exists in her own memory. Several of the gathered cadets laughed at this observation, and Dorothy felt the familiar burn of humiliation that had accompanied so many similar encounters throughout her life. She looked around the circle of young faces and saw herself at their age confident, certain, convinced that the world operated according to clear rules and obvious logic. She remembered what it felt like to believe that heroism was always recognized, that service was always honored, that truth was always obvious to anyone willing to look for it. General Hawthorne stepped forward, her voice carrying a warning that seemed directed as much at Colonel Whitfield as at the cadets. Colonel, I think you might want to consider that there are aspects of military operations from that era that remain classified at levels beyond your current clearance. Whitfield's expression shifted to something Dorothy recognized as bureaucratic defensiveness. General, with all due respect, I have top-secret clearance and access to historical military records through my position here at the Academy. If this woman had been involved in legitimate special operations, there would be some record of it in the databases I can access. Would there? General Hawthorne asked, her tone suggesting that Whitfield's confidence might be misplaced. Are you familiar with compartmentalized operations that were classified under special access programs? Because I can assure you that not all military operations from the 1990s are accessible through standard historical databases. Dorothy watched this exchange with growing amazement. General Hawthorne was defending her without explicitly confirming her story, walking a careful line between supporting a fellow veteran and potentially violating classification protocols. But Whitfield seemed determined to pursue his skeptical line of inquiry. General, I appreciate your desire to give Mrs. Clearwater the benefit of the doubt, but we have protocols in place specifically to prevent situations like this. Stolen valor. Cases often involve individuals who create elaborate stories around classified operations, precisely because those operations can't be easily verified. He turned back to Dorothy with an expression that mixed pity with official authority. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to provide additional documentation or corroborating witnesses who can verify your claims. Dorothy felt something snap inside her chest. After 28 years of quiet dignity, of accepting dismissal and disbelief, of carrying the weight of invisible service, she had reached her limit. Colonel Whitfield, do you see this tattoo? She rolled up her sleeve fully, revealing the complete design, an eagle with spread wings, surrounded by 13 stars and a set of coordinates that any military cartographer would recognize as corresponding to a location in the mountains of Afghanistan. This tattoo was done in 1992 at a parlor in Fayetteville, North Carolina, 3 blocks from Fort Bragg. It was designed specifically for members of my unit, and the coordinates represent the location where 3 of my teammates died in service to this country. Each of the 13 stars represents one of the original Night Talons, and the eagle represents our mission to strike from darkness and disappear before dawn. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Now, Colonel, I want you to explain to me how a logistics officer from Kentucky would know the precise coordinates of a classified operations site in Afghanistan. would have a tattoo matching the design of a supposedly fictional military unit, and would continue making annual pilgrimages to honor fallen comrades for 28 years if she was simply making up stories about military service. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a fired round. Dorothy had just revealed information that, if her story was true, could potentially compromise ongoing operations or intelligence assets. If her story was false, she had just committed a federal crime by claiming knowledge of classified operations. Either way, the stakes had just risen dramatically. Cadet Mitchell, apparently sensing that he was witnessing something significant, raised his phone higher to capture Dorothy's full expression. "So you're saying that this tattoo proves you were in some kind of secret special forces unit? That seems pretty weak, lady. Anyone could get a military tattoo and make up coordinates." "Try me," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the cold precision of someone who had spent years giving life or death orders. "Those coordinates point to a cave system 17 kilometers northeast of Kandahar. The elevation is 2,847 meters above sea level. The local population calls it the place where eagles nest, which is why we chose the eagle for our insignia." On November 15, 1994, at approximately 0347 hours local time, 3 American servicewomen died in that cave system while extracting 12 Afghan civilians who had been taken hostage by Taliban forces. The specificity of her information clearly unsettled Colonel Whitfield, but he pressed forward with the dogged determination of someone who had committed to a position and couldn't back down without losing face. "Mrs. Clearwater, I don't know where you obtained this information, but I can tell you with certainty that there are no records of American servicewomen conducting operations in Afghanistan in 1994. The United States had minimal military presence in that region at that time." Dorothy smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, but it was not a pleasant expression. "Exactly, Colonel. That's exactly the point. We weren't there officially. We didn't exist officially. And when we died, we weren't mourned officially. But we were there, and we did die. And those 12 Afghan civilians lived because 3 American women gave their lives in a cave that the military claims never housed American personnel." General Hawthorne was watching this exchange with an expression Dorothy couldn't quite read, part admiration, part concern, part calculation. The general was clearly weighing multiple factors: the potential security implications of this conversation, the growing crowd of witnesses, the recording devices that were capturing every word, and the possibility that Dorothy was exactly who she claimed to be. "Colonel Whitfield," General Hawthorne said finally, "I think this conversation has moved beyond the scope of routine security verification. I recommend we continue this discussion in a more appropriate venue." But Dorothy was no longer interested in private conversations or appropriate venues. 28 years of appropriate venues had gotten her nowhere. 28 years of following protocols and respecting classifications had left her sisters buried in unmarked bureaucratic graves while their sacrifices went unrecognized and their stories untold. "No," Dorothy said firmly, her voice carrying across the courtyard with the authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in combat. "I'm done with private conversations and classified discussions and appropriate venues. If you want to challenge my credentials, Colonel, then let's do it right here, right now, in front of everyone." The tension in the courtyard had reached a breaking point when the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors cut through the November air. Every head turned skyward as a military transport helicopter approached the Academy's landing pad, its arrival unscheduled and unexpected. The distinctive markings on its hull indicated it belonged to the Pentagon's Special Operations Command, and its sudden appearance suggested that word of the confrontation had somehow reached the highest levels of military leadership. As the helicopter settled onto the landing pad adjacent to the memorial courtyard, Dorothy felt her heart begin to race. In all her years of making this pilgrimage, she had never drawn this level of attention. The arrival of Pentagon personnel could mean validation of her claims, or it could mean she was about to be arrested for revealing classified information. After 28 years of careful silence, she had potentially triggered a chain of events that could expose not just her own story, but the entire suppressed history of the Night Talons. The helicopter's side door slid open, and 3 figures emerged. The first was a tall woman in her 60s, wearing the uniform of a brigadier general, her bearing suggesting someone accustomed to command at the highest levels. Behind her came a younger man in civilian clothes, whose presence screamed federal intelligence. And finally, moving slowly but with unmistakable dignity, an elderly black woman using a walking cane. Dorothy's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the third figure. Even after 30 years, even with the changes that age had brought, she would know that face anywhere. It was Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Cross, her former commanding officer and the woman who had led the Night Talons through their most dangerous missions. Victoria was supposed to be dead at least. That's what Dorothy had believed for the past 15 years, when all her attempts to contact her former commander had been met with official statements about a training accident in 1998. The crowd of cadets and academy staff parted unconsciously as the 3 newcomers approached. General Hawthorne straightened to attention, clearly recognizing the Pentagon general despite not having been formally introduced. Colonel Whitfield looked increasingly uncomfortable, apparently sensing that the situation had spiraled far beyond his ability to control or understand. "I am Brigadier General Amanda Stevens from Pentagon Special Operations Command," the lead figure announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of making decisions that affected national security. "I understand there's been some discussion here regarding historical military operations that fall under my jurisdiction." Dorothy found herself unable to speak as Victoria Cross approached her wheelchair. The woman who had once been her commanding officer looked older, frailer than Dorothy remembered, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made her one of the most effective special operations commanders of her generation. "Hello, Dorothy," Victoria said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "It's been far too long." The simple greeting hit Dorothy like a physical blow. For 15 years, she had believed she was one of only a handful of Night Talon survivors. Learning that Victoria was alive, that she had been alive all this time while Dorothy carried the weight of their shared history alone, unleashed a flood of emotions that Dorothy had been suppressing for decades. "Vic," Dorothy whispered, using the nickname that only the Night Talons had been permitted to use. "They told me you died in a training accident. I've been visiting your memorial plaque at Arlington every year." Victoria's expression darkened, with something that might have been guilt or regret. "I'm sorry, Dorothy. The official story was necessary for operational security. After the Night Talons were disbanded, I was reassigned to deep cover operations that required my death to be convincingly staged. I've been operating under a different identity for the past 25 years. The revelation sent a murmur through the gathered crowd. Cadet Brennan, who had been growing increasingly quiet as the situation escalated beyond his understanding, stepped forward with the desperate bravado of someone trying to maintain relevance in a conversation that had moved far beyond him. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice carrying a note of panic. "Are you people seriously trying to tell us that this woman in the wheelchair is some kind of secret agent? And now there's another supposed secret agent who faked her own death? This is getting ridiculous." The civilian from the helicopter, who had been quietly observing the interaction, finally spoke. "My name is Deputy Director Michael Kellerman from the Central Intelligence Agency, and I can assure you, young man, that nothing about this situation is ridiculous. Mrs. Clearwater and Colonel Cross are both listed in classified databases that confirm their service in operations that remain vital to national security even today." Colonel Whitfield, whose skepticism had been eroding with each new arrival, made one final attempt to assert his authority over the situation. "Sir, with all due respect, I need to see some identification from all of you. This is a military academy with specific security protocols, and we can't simply accept claims about classified operations without proper verification." Brigadier General Stevens reached into her uniform pocket and produced a credentials wallet that she handed to Whitfield. As he reviewed the documentation, his face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, something that looked like genuine fear. Dorothy watched him realize that he had been challenging the legitimacy of operations at a classification level far above his security clearance. "Colonel Whitfield," General Stevens said, her tone suggesting that his cooperation was not optional, "I'm going to need you to immediately seal this area and ensure that all recording devices are secured. What's being discussed here involves operations that remain classified at the highest levels of national security." But Cadet Mitchell, apparently oblivious to the gravity of the situation, held his phone higher and addressed it directly. "This is incredible, guys. I'm live streaming what might be the biggest military cover-up story in decades. We've got a woman in a wheelchair claiming to be part of some secret unit. Now there are Pentagon generals and CIA agents showing up. And supposedly this other woman faked her own death." The phone was out of his hand so quickly that Mitchell didn't even see General Stevens move. The device was crushed beneath her boot before he could protest, and when he looked up at her face, whatever complaint he might have made died in his throat. "That live stream just became a matter of national security," Stevens said coldly. "Anyone who recorded or transmitted any part of this conversation will be contacted by federal authorities within the next 24 hours. Dorothy watched this display of authority with mixed emotions. Part of her was gratified to finally see the recognition and protection that should have been afforded to her and her sisters decades ago. But another part of her recognized that the same classification systems that were now protecting her story were also preparing to bury it once again. Victoria Cross seemed to read her thoughts. "Dorothy, I know this must be overwhelming, but there's something you need to know. The reason I'm here, the reason we all came as soon as we learned about this confrontation, is that things have changed. The political landscape, the security considerations, the administration's approach to historical transparency, it's all shifted in ways that might finally allow the Knight Talon story to be told." General Hawthorne, who had been silently observing this extraordinary reunion, finally found her voice. "Ma'am, are you saying that the Knight Talon's operations are being considered for declassification?" "I'm saying more than that," Victoria replied, turning to address not just Dorothy, but the entire gathered crowd. 3 weeks ago, the President signed an executive order establishing a commission to review historical military operations that were classified for reasons of political sensitivity rather than ongoing operational security. The Knight Talons are at the top of that review list. Dorothy felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: hope. But it was tempered by the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had been disappointed by military bureaucracy more times than she could count. "What does that mean in practical terms, Vic? Another review that disappears into committee? Another promise that nothing will come of?" Victoria smiled, and for a moment, Dorothy could see the young commander who had once led 13 women into the most dangerous missions the military could devise. "It means that in 6 weeks, there's going to be a congressional hearing on suppressed military operations. It means that the families of our fallen sisters are finally going to learn how their daughters really died. And it means that you, Dorothy Clearwater, are going to be the primary witness testifying about what the Knight Talons accomplished and what it cost." The words hung in the November air like a promise that Dorothy had been waiting 28 years to hear. Around them, the cadets and academy staff stood in stunned silence, processing the realization that they had just witnessed the first moments of what might become a significant piece of American military history. Cadet Brennan, who had started This confrontation with casual cruelty and escalated it with ignorant skepticism. Finally understood the magnitude of what he had stumbled into. The elderly woman he had mocked for struggling with her wheelchair was about to become the center of a national conversation about military service, sacrifice, and the systematic erasure of women's contributions to combat operations. But Dorothy was looking past the immediate crowd, past the academy buildings, toward a horizon that suddenly seemed full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. After 28 years of carrying invisible wounds and honoring invisible heroes, she was about to have the chance to make both visible to the world. The transformation in how Dorothy was treated following the Pentagon's arrival was so dramatic. It felt surreal. Where minutes earlier she had been dismissed as a confused elderly woman making false claims, she was now being escorted across the academy grounds by federal agents and Pentagon officials who treated her with the deference typically reserved for heads of state. General Hawthorne had personally taken charge of Dorothy's wheelchair, insisting on pushing it herself as a gesture of respect that Dorothy found both touching and symbolically powerful. The Academy's VIP conference room had been hastily converted into a secure briefing area, with military police stationed outside and electronic countermeasures activated to prevent any surveillance or recording. Dorothy found herself seated at the head of a polished mahogany table that had probably hosted countless meetings with distinguished visitors, but never, she suspected, with someone whose very existence had been classified for 3 decades. Victoria Cross took the seat beside her, and Dorothy noticed her former commander's hands trembling slightly as she arranged the classified folders she had brought with her. Despite her composed exterior, Victoria was clearly struggling with emotions that went far beyond their unexpected reunion. Dorothy recognized the signs, the hypervigilance, the careful control of facial expressions, the way Victoria's eyes constantly scanned the room for potential threats. These were the behavioral patterns of someone who had been living under deep cover for so long that normal human interactions felt dangerous. "Before we begin," Brigadier General Stevens announced, "I want to establish the security parameters for this conversation. Everyone in this room now has temporary clearance to discuss Operation Midnight Eclipse and related Night Talons operations, but that clearance expires the moment you leave this building. Any unauthorized disclosure of what you learn here today will be prosecuted under the Espionage Act." Dorothy felt a familiar chill at the mention of the Espionage Act, the same legal framework that had been used to silence her and her sisters for nearly 3 decades. Even in this moment of recognition and validation, the threat of imprisonment still hung over any attempt to tell their story publicly. Deputy Director Kellerman opened one of the folders in front of him, revealing what appeared to be personnel files with multiple classification stamps. "Mrs. Clearwater, I'm going to read from your actual service record, not the sanitized version that appears in your discharge papers, but the complete file that's been sealed in CIA archives since 1995. Dorothy steeled herself. She had never seen her complete file, had never known exactly how much the government knew about her service or how it had been documented. For 28 years, she had carried her memories like secret treasures, never knowing if they matched the official record or if that record even existed. Lieutenant Dorothy Ann Clearwater, commissioned through Officer Candidate School in 1991, selected for classified operations in 1992. Based on psychological profiles indicating exceptional stress tolerance, linguistic aptitude, and what the evaluators termed adaptive leadership under extreme conditions. Initial assignment to the newly formed Night Talons unit under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Cross. Kellerman paused, looking up at Dorothy with an expression that mixed professional respect with something that might have been apology. "The psychological evaluation also noted that you scored in the 99th percentile for what they called operational invisibility, the ability to blend into civilian populations without detection." The evaluator wrote, and I quote, Lieutenant Clearwater possesses the rare combination of exceptional tactical intelligence and natural camouflage that makes her ideally suited for operations where conventional forces would be immediately compromised. Dorothy felt tears threatening for the first time since the confrontation began. After decades of being dismissed and overlooked, hearing her capabilities described in such clinical, professional terms felt like a kind of vindication she hadn't known she needed. The operational invisibility that had made her so effective as a night Talon was the same quality that had made it easy for bureaucrats to erase her. Contributions later, Victoria reached over and squeezed Dorothy's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable during their military service, when physical contact between officers was strictly regulated. Dorothy, there's something else you need to know. The Night Talons didn't end with Operation Midnight Eclipse. After you and the other survivors were reassigned, I was ordered to continue the program under even deeper classification. Dorothy looked at her former commander with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been betrayal. You mean the unit continued to operate? While we were told it was disbanded. For 12 more years, Victoria confirmed, her voice heavy with guilt. Between 1995 and 2007, I recruited and trained 4 more iterations of Night Talons. Different women, same mission profile, same invisibility within the system. We conducted operations in Bosnia, Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan that officially never happened. General Stevens leaned forward, her expression grave. Mrs. Clearwater, what Colonel Cross is telling you is that your unit wasn't just successful, it was so successful that it became a permanent, if completely deniable, part of American Special Operations capability. The Night Talons program continued for 15 years after your iteration was disbanded, saving hundreds of lives and completing missions that conventional forces couldn't approach. Dorothy struggled to process this information. While she had been living with the belief that the Night Talons had been a failed experiment that was quickly terminated, the program had actually been expanded and institutionalized. Her sisters had died not in a one-time operation that was then buried, but in the foundational mission of a program that became central to American counterterrorism operations. How many women? Dorothy asked quietly. How many more Night Talons were there? After us? Victoria's expression darkened. 57 total across all iterations. We lost 18 in combat operations. Like your sisters, they were buried without recognition. Their families told they died in training accidents or non-combat incidents. The numbers hit Dorothy like physical blows. 57 women had followed in their footsteps, carrying the same secrets, facing the same invisibility, making the same sacrifices that would never be officially acknowledged. 18 more had died the way her sisters had died alone, unrecognized, their contributions erased from the historical record. Colonel Whitfield, who had been sitting in stunned silence since the Pentagon officials arrived, finally found his voice. Ma'am, if this program was so successful, why was it classified beyond normal special operations security? Why not acknowledge these women's contributions? Deputy Director Kellerman and General Stevens exchanged glances before Kellerman answered. Because the Night Talons operated in countries where the United States officially had no military presence, conducted operations that would have been politically impossible to acknowledge, and achieved success rates that would have forced uncomfortable questions about why women weren't being utilized in special operations roles across the entire military. In other words, Dorothy said, her voice carrying a bitterness earned through decades of suppressed anger, our effectiveness was politically inconvenient. It was easier to deny we existed than to explain why women were capable of completing missions that male units couldn't handle. That's exactly right, General Stevens confirmed. And that's why this declassification review is so important. The political climate has changed enough that the Administration believes these operations can finally be acknowledged without destabilizing current military doctrine or international relationships. Victoria opened another folder, revealing photographs. That made Dorothy's breath catch. They were pictures of the memorial wall outside, the same wall she had been visiting for 28 years, searching for names that weren't there. But these photographs had been digitally altered to show how the wall would look with additional names engraved in the granite. Linda Martinez, Rachel Thornton, Amanda Rodriguez, and all the other Knight Talons who had died without recognition. Dorothy, Victoria said softly, if the congressional hearing goes well, if the public responds positively to the declassification, these women's names will be added to every military memorial where they belong. Arlington, the Vietnam Memorial, the Afghanistan Memorial, and yes, this wall right outside this building. Dorothy studied the altered photographs, seeing her sister's names rendered in the same gold lettering that honored other fallen soldiers. After 28 years of carrying their memory alone, the possibility of sharing that burden with the American people felt almost too overwhelming to contemplate. General Hawthorne, who had been quietly observing this extraordinary briefing, leaned forward with a question that cut to the heart of Dorothy's long struggle. Mrs. Clearwater, how does it feel to finally have your service officially recognized? To know that your sister's sacrifices will be acknowledged? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, considering not just the question, but the surreal nature of her entire day. This morning, she had been a dismissed elderly woman struggling with her wheelchair. Now she was sitting in a room with Pentagon generals and CIA directors, learning that her military service had been far more significant and lasting than she had ever imagined. General Hawthorne, Dorothy finally replied, it feels like waking up from a very long nightmare. But it also feels terrifying, because for 28 years, carrying this secret has been my private burden and my private honor. Making it public means sharing something that's been mine alone for most of my adult life. She paused, looking around the table at the faces of people who were offering her something she had never dared to hope for: official validation, public recognition, and the restoration of her place in military history. But if going public means that Linda and Rachel and Amanda and all the others finally get the honor they earned with their lives, then I'm ready to tell the world everything. As the immediate euphoria of recognition began to settle, Dorothy noticed that the Pentagon officials were exchanging glances that suggested their revelations were far from complete. Deputy Director Kellerman closed the personnel file he had been reading from and opened a much thicker folder marked with classification stamps Dorothy had never seen before. The weight of whatever was in that folder seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. Mrs. Clearwater, Kellerman began, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone about to deliver difficult news. Before we proceed with any public disclosure, there are aspects of the Knight Talons program that you weren't aware of during your service. Information that has significant implications for how we approach the declassification process. Dorothy felt her stomach tighten. After 30 years of carrying what she thought was the complete truth about her unit, she was apparently about to learn that the reality was even more complex than she had imagined. Victoria's expression had shifted to something Dorothy recognized from their military days, the look of someone bracing for incoming fire. What kind of aspects? Dorothy asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. General Stevens took over the explanation, her voice carrying the weight of institutional knowledge that came from decades at the highest levels of military command. The Knight Talons program wasn't just an experiment in women's special operations capabilities. It was part of a broader initiative to create completely deniable military assets units that could operate without any connection to official American military structure. Dorothy felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. But the picture they formed was more disturbing than anything she had anticipated. You mean we weren't just classified? We were designed to be disavowed. That's exactly what I mean, Stevens confirmed. The Night Talons program was structured so that if any operation went wrong, if any team was captured or killed, the United States government could deny their existence with complete plausibility. No official records, no acknowledgement of training, no connection to any recognized military unit. Victoria finally spoke. Her voice, heavy with guilt that Dorothy was beginning to understand, went far deeper than simple secrecy. Dorothy, when I recruited you and the others, I believed we were serving our country in the most honorable way possible. I didn't fully understand that we were also serving as a test case for how completely the military could erase inconvenient operations. Kellerman pulled out a document that appeared to be some kind of policy memo. Its pages yellowed with age, but its classification stamps still bright red. This is a 1991 directive from the Department of Defense outlining what they called enhanced operational security through personnel compartmentalization. It specifically recommended the creation of military units that could be disbanded and denied without leaving any bureaucratic trace. Dorothy read over the document's visible portions, her military training allowing her to decode the bureaucratic language that disguised its true meaning. What she was looking at was essentially a blueprint for creating soldiers who could be erased not just from history, but from existence itself. The Night Talons hadn't just been classified, they had been designed as a prototype for disposable military assets. How many other units? Dorothy asked, though she dreaded the answer. How many other programs like the Night Talons were created under this directive? Stevens hesitated before answering. Based on what we've been able to piece together from classified archives, at least 12 different experimental units were created between 1991 and 2001. Different specializations, different operational theaters, but all following the same basic model of complete deniability. The scope of what Dorothy was learning threatened to overwhelm her. The Night Talons hadn't been a unique program that was tragically buried. They had been one piece of a systematic effort to create military capabilities that existed outside the normal framework of accountability and recognition. Her sisters hadn't died in an unfortunate accident of classification. They had died as part of a deliberate policy of military disposability. Colonel Whitfield, who had been growing increasingly pale as the conversation progressed, leaned forward with a question that Dorothy suspected he was afraid to ask. Are any of these other units still active? Are there currently American military personnel operating under this kind of deep classification? The silence that followed his question was answer enough. Dorothy realized that what she was learning wasn't just historical information. It was an ongoing reality that affected current military operations and active personnel. The system that had erased her sisters was still functioning, still creating invisible soldiers whose sacrifices would never be acknowledged. That's part of why this declassification review is so sensitive, Kellerman explained. Acknowledging the Night Talons program means acknowledging the entire enhanced operational security framework. It opens questions about current operations that the intelligence community isn't prepared to answer. Dorothy felt a familiar anger beginning to build, the same rage that had sustained her through 28 years of silence, but now magnified by the understanding that the injustice she had experienced was not an aberration but a deliberate policy that was still being implemented. So you're telling me that there are women and men currently serving in units designed to be erased if their operations become politically inconvenient? I'm telling you that the conversation we're having right now is being closely monitored by people who have significant concerns about how much of this information becomes public, Stevens replied carefully. There are officials within the Department of Defense and the intelligence community who believe that acknowledging historical programs like the Night Talons could compromise current operational security. Victoria opened another folder, this one containing what appeared to be organizational charts and budget documents. Dorothy, what General Stevens is trying to tell you is that we're not just fighting to get recognition for our sisters who died. We're fighting against an entire institutional structure that has invested billions of dollars and 30 years of policy development in maintaining systems of military deniability. Dorothy studied the organizational charts, seeing the night Talon's program represented as a small box in a vast network of similar classifications. The visual representation of how insignificant their unit appeared within the larger framework was both humbling and infuriating. They had thought they were elite soldiers serving their country. They had actually been expendable test subjects. In a much larger experiment, who benefits from this system? Dorothy asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Who has an institutional interest in maintaining units that can be denied and erased? Kellerman's expression suggested he was approaching the limits of what he was authorized to discuss. Let's just say that there are contractors, agencies, and military commands that have built their operational capabilities around assets that exist outside normal oversight and accountability structures. Acknowledging historical programs raises questions about current programs that some people aren't prepared to answer. The implication was clear. The Night Talon story couldn't be told in isolation. Acknowledging their existence and sacrifice would inevitably lead to questions about similar units currently operating under the same framework of deniability. Dorothy realized that she wasn't just fighting for historical recognition, she was potentially threatening an entire ecosystem of classified operations that relied on invisibility for their effectiveness. General Hawthorne, who had been quietly absorbing these revelations, finally spoke with a question that cut to the heart of Dorothy's moral dilemma. Mrs. Clearwater, knowing what you know now about the broader implications, are you still committed to testifying at the congressional hearing? Understanding that your testimony could compromise current operations and put active personnel at risk? Dorothy looked around the table at the faces of people who were offering her a choice she had never expected to have. She could accept private recognition, knowing that her service had been officially acknowledged by the highest levels of government. She could take comfort in the knowledge that her sister's sacrifices had been documented and remembered, even if that remembrance remained classified. She could choose the path that protected current operations and active personnel, preserving the system that had both utilized and erased her. Or she could choose the path that might finally break the cycle of invisible soldiers and disposable heroes, even if it meant accepting personal risk and potentially compromising ongoing operations. General Hawthorne, Dorothy said finally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. 30 years ago, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Nothing in that oath suggested that my defense would be temporary, conditional, or limited to operations that were politically convenient to acknowledge. She paused, looking directly at each official in turn before continuing. That's exactly what I mean, Stevens confirmed. The Night Talons program was structured so that if any operation went wrong, if any team was captured or killed, the United States government could deny their existence with complete plausibility. No official records, no acknowledgement of training, no connection to any recognized military unit. Victoria finally spoke. Her voice, heavy with guilt that Dorothy was beginning to understand, went far deeper than simple secrecy. Dorothy, when I recruited you and the others, I believed we were serving our country in the most honorable way possible. I didn't fully understand that we were also serving as a test case for how completely the military could erase inconvenient operations. Kellerman pulled out a document that appeared to be some kind of policy memo. Its pages yellowed with age, but its classification stamps still bright red. This is a 1991 directive from the Department of Defense outlining what they called enhanced operational security through personnel compartmentalization. It specifically recommended the creation of military units that could be disbanded and denied without leaving any bureaucratic trace. Dorothy read over the document's visible portions, her military training allowing her to decode the bureaucratic language that disguised its true meaning. What she was looking at was essentially a blueprint for creating soldiers who could be erased not just from history, but from existence itself. The Night Talons hadn't just been classified. They had been designed as a prototype for disposable military assets. How many other units? Dorothy asked, though she dreaded the answer. How many other programs like the Night Talons were created under this directive? Stevens hesitated before answering. Based on what we've been able to piece together from classified archives, at least, Mrs. Clearwater, Stevens said, pausing in her dialing. If you're committed to full disclosure, then we need to accelerate our timeline significantly. There are other survivors from the various programs who have been waiting for an opportunity like this, but we had planned to approach them gradually over several months. Your decision means we need to coordinate their involvement immediately. Dorothy felt a shock of recognition. Other survivors? From the Night Talons? Victoria leaned forward, her expression mixing hope with caution. Not just Night Talons, Dorothy. Remember, there were 12 different programs created under the Enhanced Operational Security Directive. Some of those units had survivors who, like you, have been carrying their secrets in isolation for decades. Kellerman was already working his way through the contact list, his voice taking on the crisp efficiency of someone coordinating a complex operation. I need immediate contact with Patricia Vance in Oregon. She was part of the Arctic Wolves program in Alaska. Get me Commander Sarah Chun in San Francisco Deep, current operations in the South China Sea, and locate Dr. Rebecca Martinez in Texas. She was medical support for the Desert Phantoms program in Syria. As Dorothy listened to the names and unit designations, she began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. She had thought she was fighting for recognition of a single unit, but apparently she was becoming the catalyst for exposing an entire hidden chapter of American military history. The weight of that responsibility felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. General Hawthorne, who had been quietly observing this rapid coordination, stepped forward with a question that Dorothy realized she should have thought to ask. How many total survivors are we talking about? How many people have been carrying these secrets? Stevens checked her secure tablet before answering. Based on our current database, we have 37 confirmed survivors across all programs. Some are still active military under different identities, like Colonel Cross was. Others have been living civilian lives, believing they were the only ones who remembered their units. A few have been institutionalized for what was diagnosed as PTSD-related delusions about military service that couldn't be verified. The last category hit Dorothy particularly hard. She thought about her own struggles with isolation and the constant questioning of her own memories that came from carrying unverifiable experiences. How many of her fellow survivors had been driven to seek mental health treatment, only to have their real experiences dismissed as trauma-induced fantasies because there were no official records to support their accounts? We need legal protection. For all of them, Dorothy said, her strategic mind beginning to engage with the complexities of what they were attempting. If 37 people are going to come forward with classified information, we need guarantees that they won't face prosecution under the Espionage Act. Victoria smiled, the first genuine expression of pleasure Dorothy had seen from her former commander since their reunion. That's exactly what I've been working on for the past 3 years. The executive order that established the declassification commission also included specific whistleblower protections for personnel involved in historically suppressed operations. Kellerman looked up from his communication efforts with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal relief. I've reached 6 of the priority contacts already. Patricia Vance burst into tears when I told her about the congressional hearing. She's been trying to get recognition for the Arctic Wolves for 15 years. Commander Chen is currently on active duty but has been given authorization to participate by Pacific Fleet Command. Dr. Martinez ... double quotes. He paused, his expression darkening slightly. Dr. Martinez is currently in federal custody on unrelated charges, but those charges are being reviewed in light of new information about her classified service record. Dorothy felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. The federal charges, are they legitimate, or are they a way of silencing someone who was getting too close to exposing their program? That's exactly what we're trying to determine, Stevens replied. Dr. Martinez was arrested 6 months ago on charges of illegally accessing classified databases. She claimed she was trying to find records of her unit's medical operations in Syria, but without official acknowledgement of her service. Her access appeared to be unauthorized computer intrusion. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more insidious than Dorothy had imagined. The same classification systems that protected these programs were being used as weapons against the survivors who tried to seek recognition or verification of their service. Any attempt to find official records could be prosecuted as unauthorized access. Any public discussion of their experiences could be charged as disclosure of classified information. The survivors had been effectively trapped in a legal framework that made it impossible to prove their service without committing federal crimes. Victoria was coordinating with someone on her secure phone, speaking in the kind of operational shorthand that Dorothy remembered from their military days. When she ended the call, her expression carried the focused intensity of someone executing a complex mission plan. "We have a problem," Victoria announced. "3 of the survivors I've been monitoring have gone silent in the past 72 hours. Maria Rodriguez from the Desert Phantoms, Thomas Park from the Night Shadows, and Jennifer Wu from the Ocean Rangers. None of them are responding to our usual contact protocols." Dorothy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. "Missing or silenced? Unknown," Stevens replied grimly. "But the timing is suspicious. All 3 had been contacted by our preliminary research team within the past month, asking them to consider participating in the declassification process. Now they're all unreachable simultaneously." Kellerman was already typing rapidly on his Coleman secure tablet. "I'm requesting immediate welfare checks through local law enforcement, but we need to assume that opposition to this declassification has moved beyond bureaucratic resistance. If people are being actively silenced, then everyone involved in this process is potentially at risk." The sobering reality of what they were facing settled over the room like a cold fog. Dorothy had spent 28 years believing that the greatest threat to her story was bureaucratic indifference and institutional inertia. Now she was learning that there might be active efforts to prevent the truth from emerging, potentially including threats to the survivors themselves. General Hawthorne moved closer to Dorothy's wheelchair, her protective instincts clearly engaged. "Mrs. Clearwater, given these developments, do you want to reconsider your decision to testify publicly? We could arrange for your story to be told through official channels without putting you at personal risk." Dorothy looked around the room, at the faces of people who were offering her an escape route from a situation that was clearly more dangerous than any of them had initially realized. But as she considered their suggestion, her mind went to the 3 missing survivors, people who had apparently been silenced just for considering telling their stories. If she backed down now, if she chose safety over truth, what message would that send to the other survivors who were mustering the courage to come forward? "General Hawthorne," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the calm determination that had seen her through the most dangerous missions of her military career. "If there are people willing to commit crimes to keep these stories buried, then those stories are exactly the ones that need to be told. If Maria Rodriguez and Thomas Park and Jennifer Wu are missing because they were ready to tell the truth, then I owe it to them to make sure their courage wasn't wasted." She paused, looking directly at Victoria before continuing. "We've spent 30 years protecting secrets that protected the people who erased us. It's time to stop protecting our erasers and start protecting each other." Victoria nodded slowly, and Dorothy could see the young commander who had once led 13 women into impossible missions. Then we do this together, all of us. Every survivor we can locate, every program we can document, every operation we can verify. We tell the complete story, and we tell it loud enough that it can't be silenced again. Stevens was already coordinating security arrangements while Kellerman worked to establish secure communications with the remaining survivors. Dorothy realized that what had started as her personal quest for recognition had transformed into something much larger, a coordinated effort by dozens of forgotten soldiers to reclaim their place in American military history. But as the planning intensified around her, Dorothy couldn't shake the image of 3 empty houses and 3 silent phones. Reminders that the cost of truth might be higher than any of them were prepared to pay. The secure communications established with the survivor network revealed information that fundamentally changed the scope of what Dorothy and the Pentagon officials were dealing with. As reports came in from survivors across the country, a pattern emerged that suggested the various classified programs had been far more interconnected than anyone had realized. More importantly, several survivors had maintained their own caches of evidence-hidden archives that could provide irrefutable proof of operations that officially never existed. Patricia Vance's call from Oregon delivered the first breakthrough. Speaking through encrypted video link, the former Arctic Wolves operative appeared on the conference room screen, looking remarkably similar to Dorothy, an elderly woman whose unassuming appearance masked decades of classified experience. But Patricia's revelation went far beyond personal testimony. "I didn't just keep personal mementos," Patricia explained, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had been planning for this moment for years. After the Arctic Wolves were disbanded in 1997, I maintained what we called an insurance archive. Every mission report I could copy, every photograph I could preserve, every piece of equipment I could legally retain. I've got a storage unit in Portland that contains enough documentation to prove the Arctic Wolves conducted 43 operations in conditions that the Army claimed were too extreme for any human presence. Victoria leaned forward, clearly intrigued by the implications. "Patricia, are you saying you maintained operational security protocols for a disbanded unit?" "I'm saying I maintained evidence protocols for a unit that I knew would eventually need to prove its existence," Patricia replied with a slight smile. "Because I learned something during my last mission that made me realize our disbandment wasn't about operational security. It was about covering up something much bigger." Dorothy felt her pulse quicken. Every revelation seemed to expose another layer of complexity to what she had thought was a straightforward story of military discrimination. "What did you learn, Patricia?" Patricia's expression grew serious. "I learned that the various programs weren't just experimental units operating independently. They were all connected through something called Project Shadowfall, a coordinated initiative that used our units to conduct operations that created plausible deniability for much larger geopolitical strategies." General Stevens and Deputy Director Kellerman exchanged glances that suggested Patricia was venturing into territory that made them deeply uncomfortable. Dorothy recognized the expression. It was the look of officials who were hearing classified information that exceeded their clearance levels. "Patricia," Kellerman said carefully, "Project Shadowfall is not something we can discuss in this forum. That classification level requires clearance that doesn't officially exist." Patricia interrupted, "Because Project Shadowfall was designed to operate outside normal classification structures. But I've got documentation, Mr. Kellerman. I've got proof that our units were being used to implement foreign policy decisions that Congress never approved and that the American people never knew about." Dorothy found herself at the center of a conversation that was rapidly moving beyond her understanding, but the implications were becoming clear. The Night Talons hadn't just been a race to hide women's combat effectiveness. They had been erased to hide operations that might have been illegal under both American law and international treaties. Commander Sarah Chun's secure connection from San Francisco provided additional confirmation of Patricia's claims. As a current active duty officer, Chun was technically bound by different security protocols, but her revelation was equally devastating. The deep current operations I participated in weren't just intelligence gathering in the South China Sea. Chun reported, her naval uniform lending official weight to her words. We were conducting what amounted to acts of war against Chinese installations, using our gender and our non-official status to access areas where traditional military presence would have triggered international incidents. Chun paused, clearly struggling with the implications of what she was revealing. If the Chinese government had captured us, the United States would have disavowed our existence completely. But if our operations had been successful enough to change the strategic balance in the region, the credit would have been attributed to other sources. Victoria was taking notes on a secure tablet, her expression growing more troubled with each revelation. Sarah, do you have documentation of these operations? Anything that proves the scope of what Deep Current was tasked to accomplish. I have everything, Chun replied. Mission plans, equipment manifests, communications logs, after action reports. I maintained a complete archive because I knew that someday, someone would try to claim these operations never happened. I didn't want my teammates' contributions to disappear the way other units had. Dorothy was beginning to understand that what they were uncovering wasn't just a story about suppressed military history. It was potentially evidence of systematic violations of American law and international treaties, conducted through units that were specifically designed to provide plausible deniability for the highest levels of government. Dr. Rebecca Martinez's situation added another disturbing dimension to the emerging picture. Speaking from federal custody, through a secure legal communication system, she revealed that her arrest might have been directly related to her attempts to document the Desert Phantom's operations in Syria. I wasn't trying to steal classified information, Martinez explained, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting the system for months. I was trying to document medical procedures that I developed during operations that officially never happened. Procedures that could save lives in current combat zones, but that can't be implemented because acknowledging them would require acknowledging the operations where they were developed. Dorothy realized that Martinez's situation represented a particularly cruel irony. Medical innovations that could help current soldiers were being suppressed because acknowledging them would expose the classified operations where they had been created. The same secrecy that was designed to protect national security was actively preventing improvements to military medical care. Victoria had been coordinating with her own network of contacts, and her next revelation added yet another layer to the expanding conspiracy. Dorothy, I've been in contact with someone who's involved in the administrative side of these programs. Someone who maintained records that were supposed to be destroyed, but weren't. Dorothy looked at her former commander with a mixture of anticipation and dread. What kind of records? Financial records, Victoria replied. Budget authorizations, contractor payments, equipment purchases. Documentation that proves these programs consumed hundreds of millions of dollars over their operational lifespans. Money that was appropriated through black budget channels that bypassed normal congressional oversight. The implications hit Dorothy like a physical blow. If Victoria was correct, then the various classified programs hadn't just been militarily significant, they had been financially massive, representing a systematic diversion of federal funds for operations that were hidden from the legislative branch responsible for authorizing military spending. General Stevens, who had been growing increasingly quiet as the revelations accumulated, finally spoke with the voice of someone who was beginning to understand the true scope of what they were dealing with. Mrs. Clearwater, what we're learning suggests that your congressional testimony won't just be about military recognition. You'll potentially be providing evidence of systematic violations of the separation of powers, unauthorized military operations, and misappropriation of federal funds. Dorothy absorbed this information, understanding that her simple quest for recognition had evolved into something that could potentially bring down senior officials across multiple government agencies. The weight of that responsibility was staggering, but it also clarified her sense of purpose in a way that purely personal vindication never could have. "General Stevens," Dorothy replied, "if our units were used to commit crimes in the name of national security, then exposing those crimes is exactly the kind of service our country needs. If people in power used us as disposable assets for illegal operations, then they need to face the consequences of that decision." Victoria was already coordinating the collection of the various evidence caches, establishing secure transport protocols for documentation that could reshape American understanding of military operations from the past 3 decades. The logistics were complex, but Dorothy could see the operational planning skills that had made Victoria such an effective commander coming back into focus. "We'll need to coordinate the delivery of all documentation to the Congressional Committee simultaneously," Victoria explained. "If we reveal the evidence piecemeal, there's too much opportunity for interference or suppression. But if we can present a complete picture all at once, with multiple witnesses and comprehensive documentation, it becomes much harder to dismiss or bury." Dorothy realized that what had started as her personal pilgrimage to honor fallen sisters had become a coordinated operation involving dozens of forgotten soldiers, massive archives of suppressed evidence, and potential revelations that could fundamentally change how Americans understood their government's military activities. But as the planning intensified around her, Dorothy couldn't escape the knowledge that they were racing against forces that had already demonstrated a willingness to silence survivors. The missing personnel were a constant reminder that the stakes of this operation might be measured not just in historical recognition, but in human lives. The coordinated effort to collect evidence from survivor archives across the country had been proceeding smoothly for 72 hours when everything went wrong at once. Dorothy was reviewing mission documentation from the Arctic Wolves program when Victoria's secure phone rang with the kind of urgent tone that immediately commanded attention throughout the conference room. The conversation was brief, conducted in the operational shorthand that Dorothy remembered from their most dangerous missions, and Victoria's expression grew increasingly grim as it progressed. "We have a problem," Victoria announced after ending the call. "Patricia Vance's storage unit in Portland was broken into 6 hours ago. Professional job, no alarms triggered, no obvious signs of forced entry, but every document related to Arctic Wolves operations is gone. The only things left were her personal mementos and non-classified materials." Dorothy felt her stomach drop. After 30 years of preserving evidence in secret, Patricia had lost her entire archive just days before it could be used to expose the truth. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, which meant that their communications were being monitored despite the security protocols they had implemented. General Stevens was already coordinating with her security team, her voice carrying the sharp authority of someone managing a crisis that threatened to spiral beyond control. "I need immediate status reports on all other evidence locations. If they hit Patricia's cache, they may have targeted the others simultaneously." The reports that came in over the next hour painted a devastating picture. Commander Chun's archives in San Francisco had been accidentally destroyed in a warehouse fire that consumed only her storage unit while leaving adjacent units untouched. Dr. Martinez's documentation had been seized as additional evidence in her federal case, classified beyond her legal team's access level. 3 other survivors reported that their homes had been burglarized with surgical precision, only classified materials taken. Personal items left undisturbed. Dorothy realized that they were facing an opponent who possessed comprehensive knowledge of their network, their evidence locations, and their operational timeline. The systematic destruction of documentation across multiple states required coordination at levels that suggested the opposition included elements within the government agencies that were supposed to be supporting the declassification process. Kellerman's secure communication device buzzed with an incoming priority message that caused his expression to shift from concern to something approaching panic. Mrs. Clearwater, we've received word that your testimony before the Congressional Committee has been indefinitely postponed due to what they're calling new security concerns related to ongoing operations. Dorothy felt the familiar surge of anger that had sustained her through decades of bureaucratic dismissal, but this time it was magnified by the understanding that forces within her own government were actively working to silence her. What kind of security concerns, and who was raising them? Victoria was reviewing something on her secure tablet, her expression darkening as she read. Dorothy, I'm looking at a classified memo that was circulated to senior Pentagon leadership this morning. It claims that the survivors involved in the declassification process have been compromised by foreign intelligence services, and that their testimony could expose ongoing operations to hostile governments. The accusation was as brilliant as it was devastating. By claiming that the survivors themselves were security risks, the opposition had created a framework for indefinitely postponing their testimony, while appearing to protect national security, rather than suppress historical truth. Any attempt to challenge the security assessment could be characterized as putting current operations at risk. Dorothy looked around the conference room at the faces of people who had been working to support her story, searching for signs of wavering commitment. She found instead expressions of determination that suggested the opposition's tactics had backfired by making the stakes of the fight impossibly clear. General Stevens, Dorothy said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made critical decisions under extreme pressure. I want to know who authored that memo and what evidence they claim to have of foreign intelligence compromise. Because if they're going to accuse me of treason to silence my testimony, they better be prepared to prove those accusations in a court of law. Stevens hesitated before responding, clearly wrestling with the implications of what Dorothy was demanding. Mrs. Clearwater, challenging a security assessment at that level would require significant resources and political support. The kind of challenge that could take months or years to resolve. Time that we don't have, Victoria added, because every day we delay gives them more opportunities to eliminate evidence and silence survivors. Maria Rodriguez, Thomas Park, and Jennifer Wu are still missing. How many more people need to disappear before we acknowledge that we're not dealing with bureaucratic resistance anymore? Dorothy realized that they had reached the moment every Special Operations Commander dreaded, the point where the mission parameters changed dramatically and success required abandoning the original plan in favor of something far more dangerous. She looked at Victoria and saw the same recognition in her former commander's eyes. What if we don't wait for the congressional hearing? Dorothy asked, the idea forming as she spoke. What if we take the story directly to the American people? Kellerman immediately shook his head. Mrs. Clearwater, unauthorized disclosure of classified information to media outlets would be a clear violation of the Espionage Act. We couldn't provide any legal protection for that kind of action. But what if it wasn't unauthorized? Victoria asked, her strategic mind clearly engaging with the possibilities. Dorothy, what if we could arrange for the disclosure to occur under circumstances that provided legal protection while bypassing the security assessment process? Dorothy could see her former commander developing a plan in real time, and the familiar excitement of operational planning began to override her fear of the consequences. What did you have in mind, Vic? Victoria was already coordinating with someone on her secure phone, speaking in the kind of rapid, coded language that indicated she was activating resources that had been prepared for exactly this contingency. When she ended the call, Her expression carried the focused intensity that Dorothy remembered from their most critical missions. "Dorothy, there's a provision in the Whistleblower Protection Executive Order that allows for emergency disclosure when the normal reporting channels have been compromised by security threats. If we can demonstrate that the congressional process has been subverted by hostile action, we can authorize immediate public disclosure under protective custody protocols." General Stevens was reviewing something on her tablet, her expression suggesting she was trying to determine whether Victoria's interpretation of the executive order was legally sound. "Colonel Cross, that provision was designed for cases where individual whistleblowers were being threatened with physical harm. Applying it to a systematic suppression of historical testimony would be unprecedented." "Everything about this situation is unprecedented," Dorothy replied. "We have 37 survivors of classified programs that operated outside constitutional oversight, documentation proving hundreds of millions in misappropriated funds, evidence of operations that violated international law, and now systematic destruction of evidence coupled with security accusations designed to prevent testimony. If that doesn't qualify as emergency circumstances, what does?" Victoria was coordinating logistics with the efficiency of someone executing a long-prepared contingency plan. "Dorothy, I've been in contact with investigative journalists from 3 major news organizations who have been researching military black operations for years. They have the resources to verify our documentation independently and the legal protections to publish classified information in the public interest." Dorothy realized that Victoria had been preparing for this moment for far longer than she had initially revealed. The coordination with journalists, the legal research into emergency disclosure provisions, the network of survivors maintaining evidence caches, all of it suggested a level of preparation that went far beyond hoping for eventual declassification. "Vic," Dorothy said quietly, "how long have you been planning this?" Victoria's expression carried a mixture of guilt and determination that Dorothy recognized from their military days. "Since 1995, when I watched them scatter our unit and bury our sisters. I've spent 28 years building the network and collecting the evidence necessary to expose the truth, regardless of what the official channels decided to do." The scope of Victoria's long-term planning was staggering, but it also explained how she had been able to coordinate the survivor network so efficiently, and how she had access to documentation that should have been destroyed decades earlier. Dorothy realized that her former commander had been conducting a covert operation against her own government for nearly 3 decades. "The question now," Victoria continued, "is whether you're prepared to be the face of that exposure. Because once we trigger the emergency disclosure provisions and release this information to the media, there's no going back. You'll be the primary witness in what could become the biggest military scandal in American history." Dorothy looked around the room one final time, seeing the faces of people who were offering her a choice between safety and truth, between personal protection and historical justice. Through the window, she could see the memorial wall where she had been searching for her sisters' names for 28 years, and she thought about all the other walls and monuments where other invisible soldiers remained unacknowledged. "Victoria," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had finally found her true mission. "I've been preparing for this moment since the day we lost Linda and Rachel and Amanda. If exposing the truth means accepting the consequences of challenging the people who erased them, then those are consequences I'm ready to face." Victoria nodded, and Dorothy could see the young commander who had once led them into impossible missions against overwhelming odds. "Then we do this together, all of us. Every survivor we can protect, every document we can preserve, every story we can tell. We end this cycle of invisible soldiers and disposable heroes once and for all." As Victoria began implementing her emergency disclosure plan, Dorothy realized that what had started as her quiet pilgrimage to honor fallen comrades was about to become the opening battle in a war to reclaim the soul of American military service. The emergency disclosure plan that Victoria had spent 28 years developing unfolded with the precision of a military operation. But the scale of public response exceeded even her most optimistic projections. Within 6 hours of the coordinated media release, Dorothy found herself at the center of a national conversation that reached far beyond military circles into the broader American consciousness about government accountability and the treatment of women in combat roles. The initial press conference took place in the ballroom of a Washington, D.C. hotel, chosen specifically because it was outside military jurisdiction and offered civilian legal protections for the proceedings. Dorothy sat at the center of a long table flanked by Victoria, 5 other program survivors who had been located and secured, investigative journalists from 3 major news organizations, and constitutional law experts who had volunteered to provide immediate legal analysis of the revelations. The room was packed beyond capacity with reporters, military affairs correspondents, congressional staff members, and representatives from veterans organizations who had driven through the night to attend. Camera crews from every major television network were positioned around the perimeter, and Dorothy could see the red lights indicating that the proceedings were being broadcast live across multiple platforms. As she looked out at the sea of faces and recording devices, Dorothy felt a moment of surreal disconnection from the woman who had struggled with her wheelchair outside Riverside Military Academy just 1 week earlier. That woman had been seeking private recognition for fallen comrades. This woman was about to expose systematic violations of constitutional principles that reached into the highest levels of American government. Victoria approached the bank of microphones with the confident bearing of someone who had been preparing for this moment for decades. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Cross, former commanding officer of a classified special operations unit known as the Night Talons. For the past 28 years, I have maintained documentation proving that the United States military conducted operations outside constitutional oversight, using personnel who were deliberately erased from official records." The room fell silent as Victoria methodically outlined the scope of what they were revealing. Project Shadowfall's coordination of 12 different classified programs. The hundreds of millions in black budget funding that bypassed congressional authorization. The systematic use of women soldiers in operations that were designed to be deniable if they failed and unacknowledged if they succeeded. When Victoria introduced Dorothy as the primary witness to Night Talon's operations, the symbolism was not lost on anyone in the room. Here was an elderly woman in a wheelchair, dismissed and mocked just days earlier, now providing testimony that could reshape American understanding of military operations spanning 3 decades. Dorothy approached the microphones with the same careful determination that had carried her through her most dangerous missions. "My name is Dorothy Clearwater. I am a retired Army captain and former operations officer with the Night Talons. For 28 years, I have carried the burden of secrets that protected the people who erased my unit's contributions and buried my sister's sacrifices." She paused, looking directly into the television cameras that were carrying her words across the country. Today, that burden ends. Today, the American people learn the truth about operations conducted in their name, but without their knowledge. Funded with their tax dollars, but hidden from their representatives, and carried out by soldiers whose service was deemed too politically inconvenient to acknowledge. The impact of Dorothy's testimony was immediate and devastating. As she methodically detailed Operation Midnight Eclipse, describing the cave system where 3 of her sisters died, saving Afghan civilians, the rescue operations that were credited to other units, and the systematic erasure of women's combat contributions, she could see the expressions of shock and outrage spreading across the room. But the most powerful moment came when Patricia Vance, appearing via secure video link from a safe location, revealed the financial documentation that proved Project Shadowfall's funding mechanisms. The screen behind the podium displayed budget authorizations showing nearly $800 million in appropriated funds, diverted to operations that were never disclosed to the congressional committees responsible for military oversight. These documents prove that for 15 years, the American military conducted a shadow foreign policy, Patricia explained, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. Operations in 12 countries that Congress never authorized, using methods that violated both American law and international treaties, funded through mechanisms designed to circumvent constitutional requirements for legislative approval of military action. The questions from reporters came in rapid succession, each one revealing new aspects of the scandal's scope and implications. How many current operations might be using similar deniability structures? What oversight mechanisms existed to prevent future shadow programs? Who in the current administration was aware of these historical operations? Dorothy found herself fielding questions that went far beyond her personal experience, but she answered each one with the precision of someone who had spent decades thinking about the broader implications of what she had witnessed. When a reporter from the Washington Post asked whether she believed similar programs were currently active, Dorothy's response cut to the heart of the constitutional crisis they were exposing. The structures that created and protected these programs still exist, Dorothy stated clearly. The legal frameworks that allowed military operations to be conducted outside congressional oversight have not been reformed. The classification systems that enabled systematic erasure of inconvenient operations remain in place. Unless the American people demand fundamental changes to how military activities are authorized and overseen, these programs will continue under different names with different personnel. The press conference's conclusion was interrupted by breaking news that validated Dorothy's warnings about ongoing operations. CNN reported that federal agents had simultaneously raided the homes of 3 current military officers in different states, apparently seeking documents related to what sources described as unauthorized special operations activities. The timing of the raids, just hours after Dorothy's testimony began, suggested that her revelations had triggered immediate efforts to suppress additional evidence. Victoria returned to the microphones with an announcement that demonstrated just how thoroughly she had anticipated the government's response. The raids being conducted today represent exactly the kind of retaliatory action that the emergency disclosure provisions were designed to protect against. We have therefore activated additional safeguards that will ensure the complete documentation of these programs remains available to congressional investigators, federal prosecutors, and the American people. She gestured to the law professors who had been quietly observing the proceedings. Professor Elizabeth Warren, Professor Lawrence Tribe, and Professor Neil Katyal have agreed to serve as legal advocates for all survivors involved in these revelations. Any attempts to prosecute, intimidate, or silence the individuals who have come forward today will be met with the full resources of the constitutional law community. The press conference concluded with Dorothy making a statement that would be replayed on news broadcasts for weeks afterward. Leaning forward in her wheelchair, speaking directly into the cameras with the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard, she delivered what many would later describe as a defining moment in the national conversation about military accountability. For 28 years, I visited memorial walls, searching for names that weren't there, honoring sacrifices that weren't acknowledged, carrying burdens that weren't mine to bear alone. Today, those names will finally be added to the walls where they belong. Today, those sacrifices will finally be recognized by the country they died serving. And today, the burden of keeping these secrets passes from the soldiers who lived them to the citizens who have the power to ensure they never happen again. As Dorothy left the podium, she was approached by a young woman in her 20s wearing the uniform of a current active duty officer. The woman stood at attention and rendered a perfect military salute before speaking. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Maria Santos, and I wanted to thank you for your service and your courage. Because of what you've done today, soldiers like me will never have to wonder if our contributions will be erased or our sacrifices ignored." Dorothy returned the salute with the precision of someone for whom such gestures carried profound meaning, then reached out to grasp the young lieutenant's hand. "Lieutenant Santos, the fight for recognition doesn't end with one press conference or one set of revelations. It requires constant vigilance from every generation of soldiers who refuse to let their service be invisible." As Dorothy was escorted from the hotel ballroom toward the waiting vehicles that would take her to additional interviews and congressional briefings, she realized that her transformation from forgotten veteran to public figure was complete. The woman who had been mocked for struggling with her wheelchair had become the face of a movement that would reshape how Americans understood the relationship between military service and democratic accountability. But even in her moment of vindication, Dorothy understood that the most difficult challenges lay ahead. Exposing the truth had been the beginning, not the end, of a fight that would ultimately be decided not by press conferences or testimony, but by whether the American people had the will to demand fundamental reforms to prevent future abuses of military power. 6 months after Dorothy's revelations transformed American understanding of military accountability, she found herself once again approaching the memorial wall at Riverside Military Academy. But this time, she wasn't alone, and she wasn't searching for names that weren't there. She was accompanied by a delegation that included families of fallen Knight Talons, congressional investigators, military historians, and representatives from the Department of Defense who had come to witness the formal dedication of the expanded memorial. The transformation of the memorial wall reflected the broader changes that Dorothy's courage had set in motion across American society. Where once there had been gaps in the historical record, now there were detailed accounts of operations that had been hidden for decades. Where once there had been anonymous sacrifices, now there were individual stories of heroism that rivaled any in military history. And where once there had been systematic erasure of women's combat contributions, now there was official acknowledgement that women had been conducting special operations missions for over 30 years. Dorothy's wheelchair was positioned at the front of the gathered crowd, but she no longer felt the isolation that had characterized her previous visits to this place. Beside her sat Patricia Vance, who had traveled from Oregon for the ceremony, and Commander Sarah Chun, who had been granted special leave from her current assignment to attend. Victoria Cross stood behind Dorothy's wheelchair in full dress uniform, wearing the medals that had finally been authorized after decades of bureaucratic denial. The ceremony began with remarks from General Patricia Hawthorne, who had been promoted and assigned to head the newly created Office of Military Historical Accountability, a position created specifically to prevent future erasures of military service. Hawthorne's speech acknowledged not just the individual sacrifices being honored today, but the systematic failures that had required such sacrifices to remain hidden. "The women and men we honor today served their country twice," Hawthorne announced to the assembled crowd. "First, they served through their classified missions, protecting American interests and saving lives in operations that required exceptional courage and skill. Second, they served by refusing to let their contributions be permanently erased, fighting for recognition that ensures future generations of soldiers will never face the same institutional denial." When Dorothy was introduced to speak, the applause from the crowd was sustained and powerful. But what moved her most was seeing the faces of family members who were finally learning the truth about how their daughters, wives, and sisters had died. Mrs. Linda Martinez, whose daughter had been killed in Operation Midnight Eclipse, approached Dorothy's wheelchair with tears streaming down her face. "For 28 years, I believed my daughter died in a training accident," Mrs. Martinez said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. I never understood why she had chosen military service, why she was so secretive about her work, why she seemed to carry such heavy burdens. Today, I finally understand that she died a hero, saving lives in the service of her country. Thank you for making sure I lived long enough to learn the truth. The formal dedication ceremony included the unveiling of new memorial panels that listed not just the Night Talon's casualties, but the fallen from all 12 classified programs that had been exposed through Dorothy's testimony. Each name was accompanied by a brief description of their final mission and the lives they had saved through their sacrifice. The military precision of the ceremony was matched by its emotional impact, as decades of suppressed grief finally found official expression. But the memorial dedication represented only the most visible aspect of the changes that Dorothy's revelations had triggered throughout the American government. Congressional hearings had led to the indictment of 17 former and current officials on charges ranging from misappropriation of federal funds to violations of the War Powers Act. The Department of Defense had implemented new oversight mechanisms that required congressional notification for all special operations activities, regardless of classification level. And the intelligence community had been forced to establish independent review boards to prevent future abuses of classification authority. Dorothy's personal vindication had expanded into institutional reform that went far beyond her original goals. The Presidential Commission on Military Transparency had recommended sweeping changes to how the United States conducted military operations, with particular emphasis on ensuring that all personnel received appropriate recognition for their service. The Commission's final report, largely based on testimony from Dorothy and other program survivors, had become required reading at military academies and was being translated into multiple languages for international distribution. Perhaps most significantly, the revelation of the classified programs had sparked a broader national conversation about the role of women in combat that extended far beyond military circles. Dorothy found herself invited to speak at universities, veterans organizations, and congressional committees about the capabilities of women soldiers and the importance of equal recognition for equal service. Her story had become a powerful counter-narrative to the assumptions about who could serve effectively in combat roles. The legal protections that had been established for Dorothy and the other survivors had also created precedents that would protect future whistleblowers who challenged military secrecy. The Supreme Court had ruled unanimously that government employees had a constitutional right to expose systematic violations of oversight requirements, even when those violations were classified. The decision, which legal scholars were calling the most important expansion of whistleblower protections in decades, specifically cited Dorothy's case as an example of how classification could be abused to hide governmental misconduct. As the memorial ceremony concluded, Dorothy was approached by a group of current military academy cadets who requested permission to ask her questions about her service and her decision to come forward. Among them was Cadet Trevor Brennan, the young man who had mocked her 6 months earlier and was now completing a research project on women's contributions to special operations. "Ma'am," Brennan said, standing at rigid attention, "I want to personally apologize for my behavior when you first visited this academy. I had no understanding of your service or sacrifice, and I allowed ignorance and prejudice to guide my actions. Your courage in exposing the truth has changed how I think about military service and personal accountability." Dorothy studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with what appeared to be hard-earned wisdom. "Cadet Brennan, the most important lesson you can learn from this experience is that heroism often comes in forms that don't match our expectations." The elderly woman struggling with her wheelchair, the quiet veteran who never talks about their service, the soldiers whose contributions have been forgotten, they all deserve our respect until proven otherwise. She paused, looking around at The expanded memorial wall where her sisters' names now appeared in the same gold lettering that honored other fallen soldiers. But more importantly, you've learned that each generation of military personnel has a responsibility to ensure that the sacrifices of previous generations are properly honored, and that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. As the ceremony attendees began to disperse, Dorothy remained by the memorial wall for a few additional minutes, finally able to complete the ritual that had brought her here for 28 years. She placed a small American flag at the base of the panel containing her sisters' names, then whispered the words she had been carrying for decades. Your watch is ended. Your sacrifices are acknowledged. Your service will never be forgotten. Victoria approached Dorothy's wheelchair as she prepared to leave, her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had finally completed a mission that had defined most of her adult life. Dorothy, what are you thinking about as we leave? Here today? Dorothy looked back at the memorial wall one final time, seeing not just the names of her fallen sisters, but the broader transformation that their story had created. I'm thinking about the young women who are entering military service today, knowing that their contributions will be acknowledged regardless of their gender or the classification level of their missions. I'm thinking about the oversight mechanisms that will prevent future abuses of military authority. And I'm thinking about the fact that no soldier will ever again have to carry the burden of invisible service the way we did. She maneuvered her wheelchair toward the waiting transportation, then paused to add one final thought. But mostly, I'm thinking about how sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with truth. And how victory sometimes comes not through conquest, but through the courage to demand that justice delayed becomes justice delivered. As Dorothy's vehicle pulled away from Riverside Military Academy, she could see in her mirror the memorial wall where her sisters' names would remain visible for generations to come. The elderly woman who had been mocked for struggling with her wheelchair had become a catalyst for the most significant reform of military accountability in American history. Her journey from invisible veteran to public advocate was complete, but the legacy of her courage would continue shaping how America honored its soldiers for decades to come. The fight for recognition had ended. The era of accountability had begun. And Dorothy Clearwater, at 73 years old, had finally brought her sisters home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.